Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. For today's video, I want to talk about what startups need to know when hiring a developer. This is specifically relevant for startups with non-technical founders. So let's say you're running a startup, it's just you, or maybe you and a partner or a couple partners, but none of you are technical, and you need to raise, well, you've already raised a round, and you need to find a developer to build your product, either an MVP, a proof of concept, whatever, and you need to hire a developer to do so, and you have no technical background to lean against when making your hiring decisions. This is a very common scenario. It's a pretty typical situation. Oftentimes I've been that person who's hired to build the MVP or proof of concept, and there's a lot of misconceptions and sort of mistakes along the way that can be pretty easily avoided if you do your research and things that you need to know. So in this video, I want to go into sort of a broad overview of what those key criteria are, so that you can make a more informed decision when hiring. So hold on. All right, sorry about that. I was just turning off the TV because it was glare. The glare was really bothering me. So okay, so first thing that's worth pointing out is understanding what kind of programmer you're going to need. So there are several types of programmers. There's a lot of kinds of programmers, just like there are many kinds of athletes. You might have a long distance runner versus a power weightlifter. Like those are two very different things, but they're both athletes, right? So you need to understand what you need from a programming standpoint. Almost every startup is going to need what's called a back-end programmer. So a back-end programmer, back-end developer, programmer. Back-end developers work on what's called the back-end, and the back-end is essentially your server-based code. So essentially, whatever data you need to store, whatever data you need to save, goes to the back-end. And the back-end is more than just a database. However, it's the entire ecosystem through which your site, your service, can deliver data from the database, as well as add data, update data, things like that. So it's a pretty important part of the operation. In fact, many would argue it's the most important, and they would have a pretty strong argument on that. However, a lot of non-technical founders are not aware of a back-end programmer, and because it's a very thankless job. So a back-end programmer is like, their work isn't seen. It's sort of hidden. It's not a visual component. So it's all the database stuff, setting up the databases properly, setting up what's called an API, REST API, setting up the security, the authentication, things of that sort. Plugging in third-party services, like maybe you want to use like an image hosting platform, or some like an audio processing service, something like that. That would all be connected on the back end, or at least it should be. And your back-end developer would be responsible for creating that architecture properly, right? So the back-end developer, or developers, more often than not, it's actually a team. The back-end developers perform a very important role in the operation. However, oftentimes for startups that are non-technical, they're overlooked because they, like I said before, back-end developers, their work is not visually, it's not consumer facing. Most end users don't see what the back-end developer does. They're kind of like the offensive line of a team. If you have a good offensive line, is a very thankless job. They're very rarely given all the credit. Usually, all the credit goes to the quarterback or maybe a wide receiver. But with a good quarterback and a terrible offensive line, it's still going to be a bad team. And if you're a football fan, you already understand that. So a back-end developer typically is where you should begin, or at least somebody with back-end development skills. And that's again, as I said, that's often overlooked. Now, the backend development tools and frameworks, that could be a whole video unto itself. I might actually do a video just on that one day. But right now, in today's ecosystem, the backend frameworks, as they're called, there's a handful of dominant web frameworks on the backend that most startups today use. These break down into the following: Ruby on Rails, Python, whether it's Django, which is the more popular one, sometimes Flask, PHP, always a big one, and Node Express, which is primarily what I do. And this is a JavaScript framework. So I kind of listed these in order of where you're going to find the most developers. Well, whatever, I don't know. There's some argument there. So Ruby on Rails is a backend web framework that's been around for over a decade. Excuse me. It's based on the Ruby programming language. It is by far the most, it's sort of the granddaddy of them all. It has the most developers. You really can't go wrong with Ruby on Rails. Most boot camps started out with Ruby on Rails when teaching their cohorts. It's considered easy. It's an entry-level sort of framework. That's probably why most boot camps began with it, and that's also probably why it's so popular. It probably, to a large extent, gained in popularity because of that. And it's tried and true. There's a very strong community around Ruby on Rails that you can sort of lean on when you need to find solutions to problems. So that's good. Python Django is sort of the next in line with that. So Django's been around probably as long as Ruby on Rails, or almost as long. It's essentially a similar full stack web framework, just written in a different language, Python instead of Ruby. So Python is the language that Django is the framework, Python's the language, and Django is a full stack web framework for web development. So generally, you're going to find either strong Rails developers. Ruby on Rails is Ruby on Rails for short, for strong Django developers. You wouldn't necessarily find both, like one guy who's really good at both. I'm sure there's plenty out there, but it would be kind of a weird thing to be good at both, because they're two different solutions to fundamentally the same thing. So you normally would pick one and get really good at that one thing. That being said, they're both very, very strong, and you really can't go wrong with either one. They're both very good. PHP is sort of, I mean, it's still very, very popular. WordPress is built on PHP. It's within the startup community, it's not as highly regarded as the other two. All right, so PHP is a bit of a, sort of the ugly stepchild of these web frameworks. I don't personally care. I'm just telling you what the perceptions are. I don't have strong opinions on any of this. I'm just telling you these are the perceptions within startup world. So like, if you're dealing with like a hipster startup in the Bay Area, and you tell them you're using PHP on your back end, you're going to get a lot of snide remarks and people kind of looking down on you, stuff like that. That's kind of where PHP is in this ecosystem. PHP has its place in this economy. It's WordPress is built on PHP, so you see a lot of PHP developers working on like WordPress sites, developing WordPress plugins, things like that. I would say PHP is the lowest end on this in terms of pay scale. So if you're looking to go really, really cheap, you want to go like under 30 bucks an hour, that level of cheap, you'll probably find that in PHP. You can probably find it on Rails as well, but you'll probably have an easier time with PHP. If you're budget conscious, PHP developers are easier to find at the lower end of the scale, the price scale, than pretty much all the other options. Node Express, or really just Node, and Node is the environment. It's called a runtime, but don't worry about that. The Express is the framework. So the framework Express would be synonymous to Django or Ruby on Rails. These are all frameworks. So Express is a Node web framework. It's a web framework that operates on the Node runtime. This is the newest of the three big ones. The three big ones being this right here. Here are the sort of the triumvirate. Node Express, or Node in particular, probably came out, I think, in 2009, give or take. However, between the three, Node Express and JavaScript in general is growing the fastest. There's no doubt about that. So Node Express is basically a web framework written in JavaScript as opposed to Ruby or Python. So it's just another different language. And it has its own sort of ecosystem around it. The most notably what's called the NPM ecosystem. And so as a startup founder, if you're a non-technical founder, why does this matter? So here's why Node Express has its advantages. If you're hiring a developer, it's written in JavaScript, which is a language which is traditionally used on the front end. So it's usually HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And the reason that matters is because if you have a very good front-end developer, very strong, let's say someone who's been doing jQuery, JavaScript for a long time, 6, 7, 8 years, that person can also be applied to the back end. The learning curve won't be as steep. Whereas if you have a front end in your conventional HTML, CSS, JavaScript, which is like 99% of front ends, and then you work on your back end using Python, Django, well, that's a whole different language, whole different runtime. Python has all of its own nuances. There's Python 2.7 versus 3.6, and like dealing with those inconsistencies and whatnot. It has its own entire ecosystem of dependencies, what's called pip. And the pip modules are different than NPM modules, and knowing which ones to use, etc. It's a whole different world, right? And then that's for Python, and then there's Ruby on Rails, right? So what's happening with Node, Express, and JavaScript in particular are the two worlds are colliding, kind of. They're starting to merge. So your front end and your back end are starting to become sort of together. I'll get to it later, but React is a big part of that. So from a long-term standpoint, you really can't go wrong with any of these. It's a matter of just what your preferences are, and also like who you know. Maybe you know a very good Python developer. Maybe you already know a very good Python developer, so you should hire that person to do the back end, and then you also know somebody's very good on the front end in JavaScript, and that's just how the cookie crumbles, kind of. That's just who you know, right? But the thing about Node Express, which is what I do, I do Python Django as well. Like these two stacks I do pretty well. But the reason why I prefer Node Express is because it's a good bridge between the front end and the back end. And so a lot of the Node modules I use, the dependencies, the third-party libraries I use on the back end, I also use on the front end. And it makes life a lot easier. The code can be even shared on the front end and the back end, and it makes your development process very, very convenient, much faster than switching between different languages, different runtimes, different packages, all sorts of different dependencies and things like that, as well as just different what's called edge cases. So edge cases being like, unique scenarios that you need to be considerate of when you're doing your development. And every programming environment has various edge cases that you just need to get familiar with over time. But if you're doing Node Express on the front end, back end, and some JavaScript on the front end, you're going to be having a lot of the same edge cases, which is good because it cuts down on knowing all these different, have to memorize all these different things. So These are key considerations on the when you're hiring a back-end developer, and you know, a lot of it comes down to just, again, your own circumstance. You know, if you're a startup and you already have a network of strong Python developers who know Django or Flask. I didn't get into Flask, but all you really need to know is Python for now, at least. Well, then go with what you leverage your advantages. You know, don't say I need a Node developer when you don't really know why. You know, if somebody said, if I was talking to a potential client and he said, well, our backend has to be on Ruby on Rails, like that is a mandatory requirement of this project, and then my next question would be, that's fine, but like why? Why did you make that decision? I'd like to understand your reasoning. You know, it's not because I'd be testing him. I would just like to understand the reasoning so I could get a better handle on this assignment. And if they either don't have a good reason or any reason at all, then I know I'm dealing with an unsophisticated person. Like the decision making is flawed, if not non-existent, right? So there are reasons to make these decisions. Like for example, Ruby on Rails. Maybe, you know, what would be a good reason to require Ruby on Rails, right? Why? Well, maybe it's because it's been around for over a decade, and so the community has grown so large that if at any point we have a very difficult problem, or I need to find another developer, I have those options available to me, because it's easier to find Rails developers than it is to find maybe Node Express developers, simply because of time. It's been around longer, right? That's a valid point. And I can get behind that. I can understand that line of reasoning. But if it's only because you read a blog post that says Ruby on Rails is the bomb and everything else sucks, and there are a lot of startup sort of founders that, you know, they think that way. They're very easily influenced by technical literature or technical people even. And I did a whole video on this, but that's one of the red flags I see when dealing with an early stage startup. I consider that a red flag. But if you have a good reason for, say, let's say Python Django or Flask, Python, you have a Python backend for you're requiring a Python backend for a project upon which you're hiring developers, right? Let's say you're talking to me and you say we need Python on the backend. There's really no negotiation on that matter, right? And I would respect that, but I would also ask why. I'd be like, all right, that's fine, but what is your reasoning? I'd like to understand it so I understand the nature of the project. And if the reasoning was, well, eventually we plan on leveraging a lot of data science, tools and whatnot, and all data science libraries and data science in general is completely written in Python, that makes perfect sense. Like, I completely understand that. I would agree with you 100%. And it's a well-reasoned out decision. It's very well reasoned. So these are the criteria upon which you want to make these decisions. Like I said, I like Node Express because you got the JavaScript on the front and the back, and that really cuts down on the friction. A lot of friction between front end and back end. Speaking of, let's get on to the other side. So there's also front end developers. So a front-end developer, it's kind of like what it sounds like. It's a developer who works on the consumer-facing side of your product, typically your website, but it could also be considered an iOS app or mobile application, or maybe even an IoT product. You can kind of think of that as a front end, but conventionally speaking, a front end is your website, your HTML, CSS. So my company, Turbo, here is the front end. Okay, this is the front end of Turbo, and this is what most people think of when they think of as web programming. Most non-programmers, they think of the front end. They envision the front end as web programmers. So the front end is pretty standard. It's pretty consistent. It's going to be HTML, CSS, JavaScript, which also typically includes jQuery, Bootstrap. At a bare minimum, your front-end developer should possess those skills. HTML, CSS, that's just your HTML, CSS. JavaScript is what makes your HTML, CSS more interactive, gives it like sort of functionality. Like when I click on this right here and this drops down, that's done through jQuery. Well, actually, no, I think this is a Bootstrap modal. But jQuery is what gives it that sort of animation effect, sort of that, well, it makes the website seem alive, kind of like it does stuff. Bootstrap is just a CSS library framework that makes your websites look nice pretty easily. It's been around for probably around a decade now, maybe even more. Most web developers, when they begin learning web development, they start on the front end. That's typically where your web development education begins. So when you're dealing with a beginner, somebody with perhaps less than 1 year of experience or up to 1 year of experience, that person probably has started with the front end and has been able to put together some decent looking front ends using HTML, CSS, jQuery, Bootstrap, etc. And it's considered a lot easier than backend, although that's changing. But traditionally speaking, the front end is considered a lot easier. And that would be accurate, by the way. The front end is a lot easier as it relates to HTML, CSS, and Bootstrap. Forget mobile and all that stuff. That's a whole different situation. But the front end is a lot easier than the back end. One mistake that I see a lot of startups make, again, is that oftentimes they don't really know that a back end is a serious part of the consideration process. So they overemphasize the front end, and they over focus on hiring a good front end developer, not realizing that they're neglecting a whole part of the application, their project, that is certainly more important than just the front end. The front end is really just sort of making your data look nice, right? One thing I do a lot in my demos is I show an Instagram front end. Here's the front end for Instagram for my local YMCA. Here's my YMCA. So what you need to understand is really what's going on here is that the front end is really just taking back end data and making it look nice. And I can literally show you the data here. If you look at if you look at this right here, here is the same data that you were just looking at in raw, what's called JSON form, in raw data form. So it's the same data. You're looking at literally the same data. But what the front end does is it takes all this data, right, and it makes it look basically pretty. That's the front end. And that's the front end's primary responsibility. But if you think about it, if there is no data, right, if the back end didn't exist, the front end has no real job to do, right? It has no data to make it look nice. So a lot of startup founders, non-technical founders, sort of miscalculate where to place their priorities, and they shoot too far in the wrong direction. Front-end developers in general shouldn't be as expensive as back-end developers, at least not at the higher levels. Again, that's because it's easier, and because typically developers begin on the front end. That's where they begin their education. So you're going to find a lot more entry level skill on the front end than on the back end per se. That being said, like I said a minute ago, that dynamic is changing. Right now, today, circa 2017, we're rounding out into 2018. It's December 18th? No, December 14th, 2017. As it currently stands, things are changing more drastically on the front end than they are on the back end. So this stack right here on the front end, oh, by the way, the word stack, I should just explain, this is sort of a slang term. The stack is what a site or a startup uses on their front end and their back end combined. That would be called the stack. So let's say I use Python Django on my backend with a certain kind of database like a MySQL or a Postgres, whatever, and then like a front end using Ember or Backbone. I'll explain that in a second. That would be my stack. That would be called a stack. It's basically the encapsulation of what you use on the back end and the front end. That would be typically called a stack. So this right here is at the bare minimum what you should possess in the front end, but it is a minimum. In the past few years, what's been happening is a lot of activity has been happening on the front end in terms of developing frameworks that are pretty much rivaling in sophistication and functionality as these back-end frameworks. So we're dealing with a lot of new frameworks on the front end that process a lot of data and manipulate data on the front end in a very sophisticated fashion. These frameworks, I'll just go through a few of them right now. Angular, Ember, Backbone. Yeah, these are front-end frameworks and libraries that exist to make data management and rendering easier on the front end and more modular, more consistent. These libraries, these first three libraries have been around for a while, probably 7 years or so, 8 years. I think Backbone is pretty much what got all this started. I think that was the first one. And then Ember, and then Angular basically was in charge for a number of years, maybe 3 years. It was what like Ruby on Rails is on the back end. It was kind of on top. But around 2 to 3 years ago, React started taking over that position. And today, React is certainly the king of the hill as far as front-end libraries and frameworks goes. And so a lot of the sort of the action right now is happening on the front end, specifically React. There are more here that I didn't list, but I'm just sort of putting down the major players, just like I did over here. There are more back-end frameworks I just didn't list because they're not as dominant as these four. So the question, as far as these front-end frameworks go, as to startup founders, is which one do I need? I'm a startup founder. Which one do I need? Right? And this is a difficult area, and you really shouldn't go it alone if you are a startup founder. This is where most people get burned. Like, if you're a startup founder and you hire a good Rails developer or a good Django developer or a good Node Express developer, you're really going to be okay if they're all good, depending on which one, what are your options, right? You really should be fine. Like, you need a back end, whether it's Django or whether it's Node Express. As long as the developer is good, you should be in a good spot. That's not so much the case here on the front end. The front end, a lot can go wrong even if you hire a good front end developer for that specific area. And it's not something I can really encapsulate in one short video, but the point is, if you're going to make a mistake, most likely it's going to be here. That's because oftentimes what happens is, the front end is also the most changing. It's changing all the time, right? You get new players in and new players out like every year, right? And you get a lot of trends as a result of that. You get a lot of trend. Right now, a big trend would be like Vue.js, right? And Vue.js might become a major player. Maybe this will become a major player inside this front-end framework war sometime soon. I don't really see that happening right now, but it might happen, right? So what tends to happen is a lot of founders will sort of hear that message from, like a meetup or a conference, or maybe they have a developer friend, whatever, and they might say like, "Oh, React is the future. You gotta learn. You gotta make sure your developer knows React, especially React Redux, with GraphQL, on the back end, and all that isn't wrong per se. I mean, React is the future. There's no doubt about it." And having a good React developer is certainly a desirable thing to have, but you might not need that right now, right? You, as a startup, you might not need a React developer right now. So why am I saying that? Because React developers, good ones, React Redux developers are very hard to find, good ones in the coastal areas. So the Bay Area and New York City, we're here. I'm in New York City, so we are in the city, but we're high in demand, so our prices are going to be commensurately high, right? So at the median level React developer in New York City is probably $100 an hour. In the Bay Area, it's probably a little bit higher. It's probably like 125, 150 per hour USD. So if you're looking at those kinds of rates, first of all, you gotta make sure you can even afford that. Second of all, the real question is, do you need that? And oftentimes the answer is no. Like for example, if you go to back to my website, I'm a Node React Redux developer. I've been doing this for a while now, and I do it professionally. If you look at this site, you are not looking at a React project, this one right here, because I didn't need React to build this. I built this on just regular JavaScript and jQuery, and that's it. It's very simple and very sort of pedestrian as far as the actual tech is concerned. If you look at this right here, I mean, this has a little bit more nuance to it. Like it has what's called Ajax, so you can just create update the UI without reloading the page. Oftentimes that's called Ajax. But even still, even here, it doesn't have React Redux. I'm just using jQuery, straight jQuery, and HTML, CSS, Bootstrap, the usual. And that's good enough for this. That's really all I need for this, right? Your startup might not need any more as well. I'd be hard-pressed to believe that your startup has such massive data requirements that you need React Redux. The question is knowing when you need it, when you don't need it. Now, if you're not a developer, you're not in a position to make that distinction. You really shouldn't even try, to be honest. I've seen a lot of money wasted on people trying to make decisions that are beyond their pay grade. If you're trying to figure that out for your startup, I'll tell you right now, chances are the answer is no. You don't need something that sophisticated. You don't need a deeply involved framework with real major state management libraries like Redux or Apollo, things like that, or MobX or whatever. You probably don't need that. However, if you're convinced that maybe you do, don't defer to your own judgment. You really should find a professional developer to make that determination for you. It's very important, because really, if you're a non-technical founder, you just don't know, and you can lose a lot of money. I don't mean like $1,000. I mean like $60,000 on the wrong developer because you didn't need that level of talent, right? So like I said earlier, as far as the back end goes, let's say you're starting from scratch and you're looking at a Ruby on Rails developer with 5 years experience with a solid portfolio, and a Django developer, same thing, 5 years experience, solid portfolio, same price. You should be fine with either. It's just at that point it's a matter of who do you like better. You should be okay with either one. That is not the case here on the front end. You could really go wrong. And I've seen it happen a few times now in my career where people just made poor decisions on the front end, tech decisions that are easily avoidable if you just consulted with a professional, took a little bit more time to weigh the pros and cons of who to hire rather than just saying, well, this guy knows React Redux, all I hear is React, 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 I should hire that guy. What if that React Redux developer wasn't so expensive what if that guy was charging $25 an hour? So you might be thinking, I'm getting the best of both worlds here. Like I'm getting somebody with a progressive skill set at the cheaper end of the scale, at the cheapest end of the scale. Almost seems too good to be true. Well, it probably is too good to be true. Here are the things you want to measure in that case. first of all, why is he so cheap, right? There might be a very good explanation, like that person lives in, you know, a third world country where $25 an hour you can live like a king, right? And maybe that's makes sense. That makes sense. Or maybe even within the United States, he lives in, you know, Wyoming, right? He's just not in a geographic area where $100 an hour is a practical rate, right? But if that person is in New York or San Francisco or the Bay Area, you know, the coastal areas, um, that should raise some questions in your head, like why are you so cheap in New York City? Um, Number two, maybe that person is just getting started. So he had picked up React 4 months ago, right? You know, he's a senior in college and he's just getting started with it. You are rolling the dice on that. It may work out, but it probably will not. Here's the most likely scenario. The developer grossly underestimated the complexity of the assignment. He will soon find himself in over his head, dealing with problems he didn't anticipate and has no real understanding of how to begin solving. Furthermore, he will become discouraged and lose interest in the project. More than likely, he will start getting other opportunities from other companies, and before long, he will leave your project anyway. This may seem like a doomsday kind of scenario. It's something I've seen many times. Right? This is not like a long shot hypothetical, right? This is a typical outcome, right? So that's going to leave you a code stack that you may have been working on for 3 months. Let's say he does 20 hours a week. That's what 20 hours times, you know, $25 an hour. It's about $400, I guess, or $500. So 20 times 20, that's $500 a week. $2,000 a month times 4 months. Let's say that you're $8,000 in the hole now. And the question then becomes, right, now I got this code stack that you know, my developer's MIA. I don't know where he went. He's not returning my emails anymore. He's just disappeared, which again, this happens all the time. This is not an unusual scenario. And then the question, all right, well, now I got this code stack. Can I hand it off? Well, what's going to happen next is you'll probably wise up and hire a more professional developer, somebody with about 2 to 3, 4 years experience, who's going to charge $75 to $100 an hour, you know, a professional rate. And you think, all right, well, if it's a professional and he's gonna get, you know, finish the job, then I can swallow that pill. Like I can take the hit on this. Well, what he's gonna say is we need to take this project and junk it and start over. Now that's a really tough pill to swallow. You might not even be able. You might just be out of money, right? But that will happen. That's gonna be his advice. So you have to understand that $8,000 you just spent and the 4 months you just lost, it's completely lost. Right? It's all gone. There's nothing salvageable there. I'm not saying this happens every time. I'm not saying like this is what's going to happen. What I'm saying is this is a likely outcome. Now, this is a likely scenario. So this is not every single one. I'm trying to be clear on the perspective here. But this is a likely outcome. So there are certainly exceptions. Maybe you find that one college kid at $30 an hour who's just so hungry to get the work done and prove himself, and he's also just a genius, and he's just really, really smart and hardworking, and he doesn't care about school. Like that's all he does. And yeah, those people exist, right? Just like people who are there are people who are under 6 feet tall who play in the NBA, right? Those people exist too, right? But the point is, what are the norms, or what are the averages? Within the one standard deviation of the mean is where you're most likely going to be, and that's where most people are. So you have to consider those scenarios. So if you hire a college kid, or someone in the city, New York City, or the Bay Area at a cheap rate, you have to consider why that is. Third, let's say he's not a young person. Let's say he's a developer with a certain number of years, like 3, 4, 5 years of experience, and he's still charging $30 an hour in New York City. That's just a bad developer. That person is not good at his job. That would be a very, very difficult thing to imagine for a good developer, because these guys are so high in demand. Um, you know, it would just be unrealistic to be a good developer and charge $30 an hour. Redux developer charge $30 an hour in New York City. So if you meet that guy, let's say he's clearly out of college, he's 30 years old, he's been doing this for 5 years, and he charges $30 an hour. Just forget it. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. That's just a bad developer. So, so yeah, the front end is where if you're gonna misstep, it's gonna be there. So that's definitely worth keeping in mind. I planned on doing a lot more in this video in terms of like how to hire, how to find where to find good people, how to distinguish good from bad, things like that. But I'm finding that this video is going a little bit longer than I expected. We're already at 40 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a follow-up video to this one with different subtopics. So maybe the next one I'm going to get into like how to distinguish a good from a bad developer, and certain tricks that developers use to make themselves look better than they really are. I'll actually do some of those tricks on my computer. To show you how easy it is to make yourself look a lot better than you actually are, and things to look out for. So that's definitely worth staying in tune for. There's a lot, there's a lot of unscrupulous people in this industry, just like there are in a lot of industries. Since there's no barrier to entry to be a programmer, you don't have to pass like a bar exam or a medical exam. You're going to get a lot of these people, and I hate to say it, but it's actually very easy to fool a non-technical person, right? It's just very, very easy. So if you're a non-technical founder, you need to be aware that you're walking into sort of a lion's den. And you need to be, the best defense is information, is knowledge. And you need to understand sort of how the game is played. In subsequent videos, I'll get into some of those techniques and strategies that people use to take advantage of non-technical founders. And hopefully you found it helpful. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.